Synovial joints are freely mobile articulations. Unlike the joints previously discussed, the bones in a synovial joint are separated by a space called a joint cavity. Most of the commonly known joints in the body are synovial joints, including the glenohumeral or shoulder joint, the temporomandibular joint, the elbow joint, and the knee joint. Functionally, all synovial joints are classified as diarthroses because all are freely mobile. Often the term diarthrosis and synovial joint are equated, and most of the synovial joints are considered to be simple, which means they just have two articulating bones. All types of synovial joints have several basic features: an articular capsule, a joint cavity, synovial fluid, articular cartilage, ligaments, and nerves and blood vessels. All articulating bone surfaces in a synovial joint are covered by a thin layer of hyaline cartilage called articular cartilage. This cartilage has numerous functions. It reduces friction in the joint during movements, acts as a spongy cushion to absorb compression placed on the joint, and prevents damage to the articulating ends of the bones. This special hyaline cartilage lacks a perichondrium. Mature cartilage is avascular, so it does not have blood vessels to bring nutrients to and remove waste products from the cartilage. The repetitious compression and expansion that occurs during exercise is vital to maintaining healthy articular cartilage because this action enhances its nutrition and waste removal. Only synovial joints house a joint cavity or articular cavity. It's a space, a potential space, that contains a small amount of synovial fluid. The cavity permits separation of the articulating bones. The articular cartilage and synovial fluid within the joint cavity reduce friction as bones move at a synovial joint. And again, on this picture to the right, you're seeing the joint cavity, and it says it's containing synovial fluid. Each synovial joint is composed of a double-layered capsule called the articular capsule or joint capsule. The outer layer is called the fibrous layer. And again, on this picture to the right, you're seeing in bold the articular capsule and the two layers, the fibrous layer and the synovial membrane. The inner layer is the synovial membrane, or synovium. The fibrous layer is formed from dense connective tissue, and it strengthens the joint to prevent the bones from being pulled apart. The synovial membrane is composed primarily of areolar connective tissue, and it covers all the internal joint surfaces not covered by cartilage, and it lines the articular capsule. As I just said, lining the joint cavity is the synovial membrane, which secretes a viscous, oily synovial fluid. Let's discuss synovial fluid next. Synovial fluid is composed of secretions from the synovial membrane cells and it is a filtrate from blood plasma. Synovial fluid has three main functions. Synovial fluid lubricates the articular cartilage on the articulating bones in the same way that oil in a car engine lubricates the moving engine parts. Synovial fluid nourishes the articular cartilage's chondrocytes. The relatively small volume of synovial fluid must be circulated continually to provide nutrients and remove waste to these cells. Whenever movement occurs at a synovial joint, the combined compression and re-expansion of the articular cartilage circulates the synovial fluid into and out of the cartilage matrix. Here's how I think of that. It's a lot like you picking up a sponge that is filled with water, saturated, soaking wet, and you squeeze on the sponge and the water comes out. If you were to put that sponge, still squeezed in your hand, over the puddle of water you just squeezed out of it, and it would expand, it would soak up the water again, right? That's how your synovial membrane works too. When you compress, the fluid squeezes out. And when you allow the expansion of the cartilage, or the synovial joint cavity, I should say. Then the fluid gets sucked right back into the synovial membrane. Synovial fluid also acts as a shock absorber. It distributes stresses and force evenly across the articular surfaces when the pressure in the joint suddenly increases. Synovial fluid, by the way, is very viscous and slippery and has the consistency of sort of like an oily snot, if you will. There are also ligaments in a synovial joint. Ligaments are composed of dense, regular connective tissue. Ligaments connect one bone to another bone and strengthen and reinforce most synovial joints. Extrinsic ligaments are outside of and physically separate from the articular capsule, whereas intrinsic ligaments represent thickenings of the articular capsule itself. Intrinsic ligaments include extracapsular ligaments outside the articular capsule and intracapsular ligaments within the articular capsule. We'll see these in a few of our highlighted synovial joints in just a moment. All synovial joints have numerous sensory nerves and blood vessels. The nerves innervate and the blood vessels supply the articular capsule and associated ligaments. And sensory nerves detect painful stimuli in the joint and basically report on the amount of movement and stretch in the joint. By monitoring stretching at a joint, the nervous system can detect changes in our posture and adjust body movements. Up on the screen, I'm telling you that some joints have anastomoses. That is a redundant blood supply, and a classic example of this would be your hip joint, where you have arteries that envelop or circle around the hip joint. This redundancy allows blood delivery even if one approach to the joint is occluded or blocked in the blood vessel or destroyed. It allows for a backup plan. There is also an anastomosis that we see not in a joint, but another example would be the circle of Willis in the brain. Again, it's a set of blood vessels that create one big giant circle, and it allows a forwards and backwards approach to blood delivery to a particular joint or important structure. Synovial joints are classified by the shapes of their articulating surfaces and the types of movement they allow. For example, we can describe their type of movement as being on an X, Y, or Z axis. So if it allows only movement along one direction or one axis, we say it's uniaxial. If it's two axes, say X and Y, we say biaxial. And a multi-axial would allow in multiple axes, X, Y, and Z, for example. As I already mentioned, all synovial joints are diarthroses, although some are more mobile than others. From least mobile to most freely mobile, the 6 specific types of synovial joints are plane joints, hinge joints, pivot joints, condylar joints, saddle joints, and ball and socket joints. On this picture, I am showing you a plane joint. It is also called a planar or gliding joint, and it's the simplest of synovial articulations, and like I said, it's the least mobile type of diarthrosis. Again, it is still a diarthrosis. This type of synovial joint is also known as a uniaxial joint because it only allows side-to-side movements. The articular surfaces of these bones are flat or planar, and examples of plane joints include the intercarpal and intertarsal joints. You know, the joints between your carpal bones and tarsal bones, respectively. And I'm sure you're thinking for tarsal bones, you're thinking calcaneus, the cuneiforms, the cuboid, the navicular. You're thinking of those. And for the carpal bones, you're probably rattling off the capitate and hamate and scaphoid, and we learned all those in lab, didn't we? A hinge joint is also a uniaxial joint in which the convex surface of one articulating bone fits into a concave depression on the other bone. Movement is confined to a single axis, like the hinge of a door. An example is the elbow joint. The trochlear notch of the ulna fits directly into the trochlea of the humerus, so the forearm can be moved only anteriorly toward the arm or posteriorly away from the arm. Other hinge joints occur in the knee and the finger in the interphalangeal or IP joints. A pivot joint is a uniaxial joint in which one articulating bone has a rounded surface which fits into a ring formed by a ligament and another bone. The first bone rotates on its longitudinal axis relative to the second bone. A classic example is the proximal radio-ulnar joint, where the rounded head of the radius pivots along the ulna and permits the radius to rotate. You do this when you pronate and supinate your forearm, I should say. Another example is the atlantoaxial joint between the first two cervical vertebrae. The rounded dens of the axis fits snugly against an articular facet on the anterior arch of the atlas. This joint pivots when you shake your head no. Condylar joints, or condyloid or ellipsoid joints, are biaxial joints with an oval, convex surface on one bone that articulates with a concave articular surface on the second bone. Biaxial joints can move in two axes, such as back and forth and side to side. Examples of condylar joints are the metacarpophalangeal or MP joints of fingers 2 through 5. The MP joints are commonly referred to as knuckles. Examine your hand and look at the movements along the MP joints. You can flex and extend your fingers at this joint. That is one axis of movement. You can also move your fingers apart from one another and move them close together. This is a second axis of movement. A saddle joint is so named because the articular surfaces of the bones have convex and concave regions that resemble the shape of a saddle. It allows a greater range of movement than either a condylar or hinge joint. The carpometacarpal joint of the thumb between the trapezium and the first metacarpal is an example of a saddle joint. This joint permits the thumb to move toward the other fingers so that we can grasp objects. Ball and socket joints are multi-axial joints in which the spherical articulating head of one bone fits into the rounded cup-like socket of a second bone. Examples of these joints are the hip joint and the glenohumeral joint, or shoulder joint. The multi-axial nature of these joints permits movement in 3 axes. Move your arm at your shoulder and see the wide range of movements that can be produced. This is why the ball and socket joint is considered the most freely mobile type of synovial joint. In this picture, it is a table from the McKinley textbook. If you are using a different textbook, almost all anatomy textbooks are universal and have tables to organize the information. I like this table because it shows not only structural classification, which means the kind of material that makes up a joint, is it fibrous, cartilaginous, synovial, and it also shows the functional classification, which refers to how mobile or not it is. Synarthroses, remember, are immobile joints, amphiarthroses are slightly mobile, and diarthroses are freely mobile, though we just learned that even the diarthrotic synovial joints, being freely mobile, some have greater mobility than others.